Hi everyone, this is Kathy with Parents for FAPE for part 4 of our series on discipline. If you haven't had a chance, please go back and watch parts 1 through 3. We hope you find it very informative. And it's really a lot of what we talk about today is going to be based on that information. So go to our YouTube channel or go to our Facebook page. YouTube channel is Parents for FAPE. Facebook is facebook.com/parents for FAPE. We hope you enjoy the content there. If you have any questions or concerns, please feel free to contact us or comment on our page or send us an email at parentsforfape@gmail.com. So let's get started. So today we're talking a little bit more about the racial and disability stats that come out and maybe try to give them a little bit more context for people because this is the hardest thing for people to understand. So this is the suspension rates by disability and race status. This is from the U.S. Department of Education, Civil Rights Division of the Department of Education. And this is the overall numbers. So this oftentimes you see this and people kind of really don't understand what these numbers mean. But to give it context, Black students make up about 12% of the population in the United States. Disabled students, they come up to about 10 or 11%. So they're smaller groups of people, but you can see on this 4.6% of white students get suspension rate are suspended, this overall. And then you see the numbers are more than three times higher for Black students and almost 3 times higher for actually more than twice as high for disabled students versus non-disabled students. And this is a problem. And part of this, and people get so confused about it, is the nature of understanding, like understanding a disability. We have communication disorders that create some weird speech patterns, and people don't necessarily understand that. They may come off as sarcastic or rude. Black students, it may be a difference between cultural things. So we're going to, or speech patterns in the Black community, or a lot of different things that may just have to do with our own bias. So Virginia is #1 in sending kids to the juvenile courts, which is a pretty awful distinction to have. If you look at the U.S. averages on the right per 1,000 students, those numbers are bad. I mean, you see that almost twice as many disabled kids are being disciplined over just the all students number. And Black students are twice as often getting sent to the juvenile courts. And you really don't want to see it's really a ridiculous amount of kids on average that are going to the juvenile courts, especially when you consider, if you look back at our part 1, where we looked at the statistics, and it's only the violent discipline actions for discipline, violent actions, it's only like less than 1%. So why are kids being sent to the juvenile courts in such high numbers? But if you look at Virginia on the left, whoa, you take 3 times as many students overall get sent to the juvenile courts. And I don't know about you guys, but I don't think that kids in Virginia are any more violent or in needing of this kind of intervention more than any other state. We're not that different from North Carolina, Florida, New York, Iowa, Ohio, California. We're not that different to have this kind of disparity. I mean, 25.3 out of 1,000 Black students go to the juvenile courts versus the nationwide 9.8. That is a huge discrepancy. And if you've ever seen these numbers, I mean, this is insane to see this many people are being sent into I mean, you see the number for disabled students, which is the highest amongst all of the students nationwide. And in Virginia, 33.4 per 1,000 students end up in the juvenile courts. And that's insane, especially when you're talking about disabled. I mean, disabled includes like emotionally disturbed. It includes otherwise health impaired, which may include like ADHD. There's autism. There's sometimes there's just behavioral problems, and there's a couple different categories. That doesn't account for 33.4 out of 1,000 to go into the juvenile, and that's insane. And if you consider the amount of cost putting them in the juvenile courts compared to just educating them, it's ridiculous. So, so when these numbers are kind of going out there, a lot of people look at them, and I pulled these comments from the Virginia Pilot social media public page, where they were talking about, posted an article about Norfolk parents, and that's one study over from Parents for FAPE. They went and protested the high suspension rates of Black and disabled students. And this is what people, and I just went and grabbed like the first 5 I saw, and it was just randomly like towards the middle. And the first one, I mean, it's just like a kind of shock that people say this out loud, but and don't hear themselves. But if teachers were not racist, more Blacks would be judged on the character and go to jail. Um, what to know? Want to know who is responsible for your kid failing, always in trouble, etc. Look in the mirror. That goes for any race. And it, yeah, you're like, yeah, this is the classic blame the parents, don't take the community look and saying, what are we doing wrong in our community that we're sending all these kids there? Also, you know, 6th grade, an argument will give them 3-day suspension. That's out of school for an argument, which you could just talk with the students about. We're not talking about like safety. If children had more recess, they'd behave better. And I once heard an administrator say to the parent, and I quote, "Apple doesn't fall too far from the tree." I agreed with her. And this is, I mean, and if you have an administrator actually saying that to a parent, that's ridiculous. I mean, because that's totally missing the point. And if a parent is talking with the administrator, it's probably because they are trying to find a solution, not necessarily that they're just trying to get their child out of discipline, which is oftentimes what we're accused of doing, especially in the disability community. We're always being accused of just trying to get our child to get away with something, and which is not the case. We're just trying to say like, hey, you got to consider the disability, and it's better to teach them than it is to just throw them away and send them out of school. So this is the hard part for everybody, is hearing the racism word, but that's what we're talking about. And I want to explain it in a way that maybe will help people understand this. Whether or not you are racist is not what we're talking about. That's between you and your maker or whatever. That's you. You need to deal with whatever it is if you do have racist tendencies. But this is not talking about you. This is about everyone as a whole. And this system is very racist when it comes to Black and white and Hispanic kids, Black and brown kids versus white kids and the way they're treated. And you saw those numbers. That's really big. And this is but when people hear it's racism, this system is definitely racism. And I want to remind people, because people seem to think of it as, you know, so long ago. But we have still people, I mean, remember the Jim Crow laws, they were in effect for a long time. And in the 1950s, they had the separate but equal, where we had segregation. It was 1956, Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas. That was the court case that actually allowed disabled kids and Black and white kids to be unsegregated and get it back into the school system, where, you know, disabled kids were put in institutions before, and the Black kids were put into crummy, broken down buildings that they didn't fund very well. In 1956, my parents were in Kansas, not in Topeka, but they were in Kansas, and they were 8 years old. And my parents are only in their early 70s right now. So we're not talking that long ago. And we also had a lot of things we were dealing with. It's only been 50 years since the I Have a Dream speech by Martin Luther King. This is not that far off from these horrible things in our history. So what we're talking about, what informs a lot of these things with this racist system, is bias. And there's a couple different kinds of bias. There's explicit bias, where we have a conscious level, we understand against a group, person or a group. And these biases may come about from a perceived threat. And then we use those biases. If we think they're valid, they're more likely to justify unfair treatment. And we can say, from a standpoint where we see right now we have an issue with immigration in this country, and we have people coming across the southern border who may be seeking asylum, and a lot of the rhetoric coming around is you hear people saying, oh, they're coming over the border illegally. And so when you see pictures of these really awful camps where these people have been kept, you see that they're not receiving basic hygiene products and or things to keep them well, and enough room and food and medical treatment. And we see that and we justify it by saying, well, they shouldn't have come over the border in the first place. And that's what explicit bias is. So implicit bias is different from explicit bias. This is something we're not necessarily aware of. We put people kind of naturally into social categories because that's the way our brain works. We try to put people in categories for our own thinking. And how we put people in categories, we do this by our experiences, but most of the time we're not, instead of real world encounters, it's going to be more vicariously. It may be because people taught us things in school. It could be that our parents taught us something. We watched it on the news. We watched it in the media. Excuse me, the books that we watched, that we read, sorry, the stories we may have heard. That's where they're all given. And we're not really completely aware of it. And implicit bias actually can be against your own race or gender or social group. And it's hard for people to understand that. You can have a black police officer arresting a black teen, sending him in front of a black judge, and still have implicit bias be a factor and still be a racist system. Because if you consider black teens to be, or black males in general, to be more violent, you feel the need to treat them more harshly. And that can happen regardless of what race you are if you have this implicit bias. And this is something that we kind of have to look at in ourselves and really truly understand our own biases and really look at it. If we start feeling a certain way, we need to ask ourselves, why do we feel that way? And what's informing that? Characteristics of implicit bias, that they're pervasive. Like I said, even the sworn to be impartial may hold them. So teachers, judges, police officers, they're all, it can affect them. They're related to our explicit bias, and they may reinforce our explicit biases. Hello, they're separate. They are definitely separate. They may not align with our own declared beliefs. We may say everyone should be treated equal. We care about kids. Oh my goodness, we see a kid being, or we hear about a story about a kid being abused or killed, and we say, oh, I would have taken that baby. But then when you see people who are poor and they say, we don't have enough money for food, we're like, oh no, you should have worked harder. You shouldn't be on that. So this is the kind of things you hear. And our declared beliefs are that we care about the children, but then when it's time to actually care about the physical children, we may not, because of implicit bias that prevents us from going there. Generally, the implicit bias are going to be to support our own in-group, which may not necessarily be your race and gender. It could be a different group, but you may only want to, may look to things of bias that would, you think would adversely affect, and maybe internally adversely affect your social group, or perceive it as that. They are malleable and can change over time. They will change on their own. They will, over time, as you learn things, you see things, and all your experiences and things you watch and hear will change them over time. But if you want to make sure that your implicit biases, your biases are kind of a little bit more neutral, you really have to work at it and truly understand what's going on and get a little bit more information and read a lot of different things and kind of keep an open mind. Cultural bias is something I wanted to put it in here because so many people have a really hard time with this, and I know that I had a really, really hard time with this when I was a kid, especially. Culture is defined as values, beliefs, and patterns of behavior shared by a group of people, and it also has a tendency to judge people in terms of their own cultural assumptions. So when you hear things like, I remember in high school, there was a report about a particular police department that was using a test, and a lot of black applicants weren't passing the test because of a certain portion on it, is the math portion. And they found they had a lot fewer black applicants that were getting accepted. So they started saying, oh, it's the cultural bias of the test. And I didn't understand that. I'm like, hey, I want them to have basic math skills because, of course, I'm not looking at the test. I don't know what it says. But I didn't understand that until my son he was in preschool. He was in a developmentally delayed classroom, and he was getting some kind of evaluation just to see where he was communication-wise. And I remember the teacher, I think I was picking him up or dropping something off, and she said, oh my goodness, he doesn't even know what a roller coaster is. And I was like, he's 3. You know, there wasn't a place that I felt comfortable enough to take him that he could, you know, he was actually small for his age too, that I could take him to go put him on a roller coaster. And I wasn't comfortable with that. And it was kind of strange at that moment. And I remember in some other testing, they were like, oh, you need to feed the duck with a spoon. And he was like, well, ducks don't use a spoon. So he's using his cultural, you know, bias in that. I don't see ducks using spoons. That's ridiculous. And so those things, they were, in my son's case, they were trying to say that he had low IQ and he had cognitive defects and what was going on, and he didn't. I mean, those aren't the case for him, but those tests told them he wasn't capable of doing better than he was. So that could affect how much special education help he would get, because if you can't do better than that ever, then we're not going to help you, is basically what the school system kind of relies on. So I didn't understand how this works, but those little things may make a huge difference. So the examples are hairstyles, religious garb, speech patterns, especially with kids with disabilities. If they talk and they sound sarcastic, that could be the speech pattern where we get angry with them because they sound sarcastic. Hairstyles, we may not fully understand that for African American hair, a lot of times you have to use braids or cornrows or various hair protecting styles that Caucasian people don't necessarily have to do and use at all. And we say we have something against, oh, if your hair has to be neat, and then we say you can't have braids. Well, that is a very neat, very painstaking process to make those, and it's to protect the hair of the individual. And so if we put something against them because we're like, okay, white people can go without braids, well, but that's not necessarily true of everybody. Religious garb, if we're like, I remember one of the schools that my kids went to, they had refused any head coverings at all. But then you have a student who comes in wearing a hijab or a yarmulke, and then what do? Well, you have to allow the head covering at that point because it's religious based. And that's where we get into trouble with a lot of these things. So how do we fix discipline in light of those implicit bias and cultural bias and explicit bias? Well, there's a lot of different things that we can do. Potential solutions are abandon the exclusion. Well, I think the first thing we all have to do is abandon the exclusionary and punitive discipline programs. It's not making our schools safer. It is not making our schools more orderly. It is not making it a better place for kids to read. It harms both the kid who is being suspended and the kids watching around who are in that kind of high suspension, high punitive discipline program, and it causes anxiety all around. We need to provide support for teachers while changing to communication-based discipline programs. We need to support our teachers, and there's a lot of climate surveys that teachers say they feel unsafe, and part of that is because there's a change happening, and understandably, especially if they're not being supported well. But this is what we need: support. And we need to be okay with letting our tax rates increase to pay for the support, because ultimately our community as a whole is going to be helped by this. Provide more behavior support for students, because that way we can teach them the behavior we expect. We can't expect them to just understand what we want by throwing them out of school. Kids don't, it's not something that's helping. And we're finding in all the literature and all of the research data that that's not working. We need to be proactive rather than reactionary. So when a kid messes up, that's when it's reactionary. But if we actually proactively start talking about these things and how, maybe even teaching the dynamics in a regular class, we can actually get ahead of it as opposed to coming at the end of it when stakes are higher. We need to teach conflict management skills students will need in the workforce. This is an incredibly important skill that so few workers going into the workforce have. And I will tell you, I volunteered on a lot of different places, a lot of different nonprofits, and yeah, this is conflict management skills and communication skills in general are very, very difficult for a lot of people. They don't want to, people avoid each other. It's awful. So we need to teach conflict management skills that people will need with their coworkers, or so when they're managers or supervisors, that they can use those skills. And that's important. That's a job, and it's something they need for their jobs to help them in earning money. Become aware of our own implicit and explicit biases. We need to really understand what those are. Understand that this change will take time, and we may be uncomfortable during the change, but change has to happen. We need to stop the bleeding of our kids going to the criminal justice system and ending up in jail and overcrowding in jail. And I mean, we have to stop that. We don't want to throw away so many members of our society, especially when we're the ones forcing them into certain roles by the way we're treating them. It's vitally important for the health of the United States. It just is. So next time, we're going to talk about different programs that are available now, and they exist now. Positive Behavior Intervention Supports, also known as PBIS, which is what our school division is slowly converting to. There's also the Dr. Green's Collaborative and Proactive Solutions Program. He calls it CPS model. He has a website called Lives in the Balance, and it has a couple books, Lost in School and The Explosive Child. Restorative Justice and Positive Learning Collaborative, which was created by a couple of teachers. So hope you join us next time, and if you had a chance to go through our YouTube channel and go through our Facebook page, we'd love comments and any of your feedback, and we will see you next time. Bye, y'all.